What is African philosophy? This is an interesting question. This is a very complicated question. And before we can move towards answering that question, we first have to consider another one. Imagine with me a 6-year-old child who is always asking questions because she's a child and that's what children do. Our question is that 6-year-old girl a philosopher? Now, you might say that yes, of course she's a philosopher, because at its core, philosophy is really just about asking questions. And so anyone who asks questions, anyone who is creative in their thinking, anyone who is curious about the world is in some way, shape, or form a philosopher. You might even go as far as saying that anyone who claims that this girl is not a philosopher is engaging in a very arbitrary game to try to gatekeep what counts as philosophy. Because in reality, a philosopher is nothing more than somebody who asks questions, so anyone who asks questions is a philosopher. And so this question forces us to consider another question. So imagine this child that we've talked about in one corner, and in another corner, imagine Aristotle or Hypatia or Wittgenstein. Is there any difference between those three philosophers and this child? After all, they are all asking questions at the end of the day. So what makes these three formal philosophers and what makes her not a formal philosopher? Is there any difference between those philosophers and this child? Now you might ask, what does this question have to do with anything? And that would be a fair point. This question causes us to wonder, what actually counts as philosophy? Is it true to say that anyone who thinks, anyone who asks questions is doing philosophy? Is it accurate to say that every nation has philosophy, every culture has philosophy, every people group has philosophy? Is philosophy a thing that everyone has and everyone does, or is philosophy a very specific, historically contingent thing that only arises in some contexts and in other contexts it does not emerge? These questions were at the heart of a lot of the philosophical debates in the world of academic African philosophy happening in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The question was, what is African philosophy? What should count as African philosophy? What should definitely not count as African philosophy? Now, there's a very problematic way to have this conversation, and I'm going to put all of the problematic elements to the side, at least for now, because there's a way to have this conversation where you suggest that Africans by their nature are incapable of doing philosophy, and there has been no philosophy on the continent at all because Africans have a problem with thinking or something like that. And you did find some ideas in some shape or form that resemble that floating around in the scholarship back in the day. So when I ask us the question here, what is philosophy? What is African philosophy? And has there been philosophy in Africa? I want to make it clear that I'm not asking that kind of question. I'm not questioning the abilities of Africans to engage in philosophy. That's not the question here. The question of what is African philosophy and has philosophy existed in Africa is separate from the question of are Africans capable of doing philosophy? Because the answer to that second question is quite obvious. Obviously, Africans can do philosophy. There are many Africans who do philosophy all the time. And of course, importantly, Africans are human beings, and human beings are capable of doing philosophy. So that is not the subject of the debate. When academic African philosophers asked if there was philosophy in Africa, they were not asking about the capabilities of Africans to do philosophy. They were asking something else. They were asking historical questions. They were asking metaphilosophical questions. And it is those discussions that we'll be talking about today. So because there are many angles here, we're going to focus on two: the work of the philosopher Paulin Hountondji, who was from Benin, and the work of the philosopher Kwasi, who was from Ghana. Both Hountondji and Wiredu were absolute powerhouses in academic African philosophy, and their work is required reading for anyone who's interested in what's going on in the discipline. So I will start with Hountondji. Hountondji has a book called African Philosophy, Myth and Reality. Now, this is not a review of the book, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going piece by piece to analyze all of his argument, although that would be a pretty fun thing to do for some other day. I mostly just want to sketch out the overall thrust of the book and some of the things that Hountondji has beef with. Hountondji's book is reacting to a lot of the things that were happening in his day. Because if the question is, what is African philosophy, one of the first responses to that question was, culture. African philosophy is culture. If you want to find African philosophy, you should look at the cultures of African people groups. And so African philosophy is found in culture and proverbs and myths and folklore. Whatever the beliefs of a people group somewhere in Africa might be, that is their philosophy. So if you're having a conversation about chi in Igbo metaphysics, that would be Igbo philosophy. If you're having certain conversations about what exists in the Ifa corpus, that would be Yoruba philosophy. If you're having conversations about vital force or conversations about Ubuntu, those would be the philosophies of the Bantu people. This is something that Hountondji called ethnophilosophy, treating culture like philosophy. Hountondji had beef with this. He did not like this approach. Now, at some point, Hountondji himself is faced with the question, well, what is philosophy? Before we can determine what African philosophy is, it might help us to know a little bit about what philosophy itself might be. And unsurprisingly, this is a pretty complicated question. So Hountondji himself does not address this question, but what he does say is that he would probably want to address a similar question, what philosophy is not. It might be a bit difficult to say what it is, but it's a bit more easy to say what it is not. And in doing this, Hountondji causes us to ask a very interesting question. Is philosophy a science? Now, this is a fascinating question because some people might say immediately that no, philosophy is not a science. Philosophy is in the humanities. There's nothing really scientific about philosophy. And although some people would classify philosophy as a social science, generally speaking, we find it in the humanities. So what is Hountondji trying to do by making us ask the question, is philosophy a science? Because the thing is, if it is true that philosophy is a science, then to our earlier question, the answer would have to be no, that child is not a philosopher even though she asks questions. And this is for the same reason that if that child were to get an easy bake oven and spend all day baking muffins with it, that would not make her a chemist, even though baking is basically all chemistry. There are a lot of chemical reactions that need to happen in order for baking to exist. So simply because someone spends their days baking, that does not make them a chemist. Simply because somebody spends their days collecting rocks, that does not make them a geologist. Simply because somebody spends their days reading dinosaur books, that does not make them a paleontologist. For something to be a science, for somebody to be a scientist, there has to be some element of gatekeeping involved. It's a very specific claim to refer to oneself as a scientist. A scientist is not simply someone who looks out at the world and wonder. A scientist is someone who looks out at the world and wonder and is able to use the tools of the scientific method to try to understand things about the world. So for Hountondji, if philosophy is a science, then it requires more than simply looking out at the world and asking questions about it. You need to also have a type of method that guides you as you ask your questions. You need to be able to share your ideas with other people who are invested in the scientific method. There have to be actual rules in place that should guide you to have debates and conversations with interlocutors as you're trying to figure out what is true about the world. And for Hountondji, ethnophilosophy cannot give us this. For Hountondji, philosophy needs two things, science and history. Now, how does history play into all this? That is a great question. Hountondji has a lot more to say, but I'm going to put him to the side for just a moment now because we need to talk about Wiredu for a bit. Because Wiredu is also concerned with this question of culture. What is the connection between culture and philosophy? And there is a connection between the two, but the idea here seems to be that these two things are not the same. These two things cannot be the same. And for Wiredu, this is because, generally speaking, cultural beliefs, cultural practices, cultural motifs lack the rigor to be considered philosophical. For Wiredu, something cannot be philosophy if the reason you believe it is because your father told you to believe in it, because your community told you to believe in it, because your forefathers declared that you must believe in it. That is not philosophical. So let's say you ran into a fellow who is part of a particular people group, and this fellow says that his father recently passed away, and so he must bury his father within 3 days so that his father can ascend to the ancestral plane. Wiredu suggests that if you ask this person why he believes this, he's likely just going to tell you that this is what his community believes, this is what his tradition is. For Wiredu, that cannot be philosophy. Philosophy involves questioning your intuitions. You cannot simply appeal to community. You cannot simply appeal to tradition in order to make philosophical claims. This is not scientific. This is not rigorous. This cannot be philosophy. And even if in some of these traditional communities people have reasons for what they believe, for Wiredu, these reasons still do not quite count as philosophical. So if that particular fellow were to say, oh, I believe I need to bury my father in 3 days because 1,000 years ago, according to our founding text or our founding myth, our ancestor buried his first son after 3 days, so that's why we all do it. And it has to be 3 days because that's how long it takes for the soul to depart from the body. Even if there are reasons given for this practice, these reasons are not philosophical. They are appealing to things that we cannot test. They are appealing to things that we cannot falsify. The scientific method involves creating a hypothesis, and you need to be able to show under what conditions your hypothesis can be falsified. When you present a hypothesis using the scientific method, you need to be able to show what would need to obtain, what would need to happen to show that this hypothesis was true, what would need to happen to show that this hypothesis was false. And a lot of these cultural practices, a lot of these cultural motifs are unfalsifiable. How can you disprove the claim that it takes 3 days for the soul to depart the body? How can you prove a claim that when you wait 3 days, then the soul goes into the ancestral plane? These are unprovable theories. So for Wiredu, they cannot be philosophical. So once more, there is a connection between culture and philosophy. A lot of the questions that we ask are influenced by our culture, but the culture itself cannot be philosophy. And this goes hand in hand with Hountondji's critique of ethnophilosophy. Hountondji suggests that one of the problems with the ethnophilosophers is that they keep suggesting that African philosophy is only found in the past, and so the job of an African philosopher is to consistently look back into culture to see what is interesting enough to count as philosophy. But this is problematic. It would imply that African philosophy is forever frozen in the past. When philosophy needs to be a living, breathing discipline, we need to be able to have debates. We need to be able to throw bad ideas away. We need to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. Another problem with the ethnophilosophy stance is that it tends to deny the presence of individual thought in Africa. And this is somewhat problematic. So if we're talking about European philosophers, we can say, according to Kant, according to Hume, according to Hegel. But when we talk about Africa, people tend to say things like according to the Yoruba, according to the Bantu, according to the Igbo. And this is a bit strange. And Hountondji takes a lot of the ethnophilosophers, most of whom were anthropologists, to task on this. Because these anthropologists, most of whom were European, Hountondji thinks were very misguided with their approach, because this is basically what would happen. An anthropologist would go to somewhere in Africa, talk to a couple of people, and then present to the rest of Europe that, oh, I have now cracked the secrets of these people. This is Bantu philosophy. This is philosophy according to the Bantu. But this approach does not take into account the fact that there are individuals in Bantu society. There are people who probably disagree with some of these cultures. There are people who interpret these cultural motifs differently. There are people who think different thoughts in any given community. And simply taking people groups as a whole and championing the whole thing as their philosophy is missing out on a lot of these nuances that are important to the practice of philosophy. And it leads to people making very strange claims about Africa that they really wouldn't make about any other part of the world. Here's a great example that I like to use. So imagine if I say I want to learn about British philosophy. So what do? I go to the home of a British family and I'm basically just hiding in the bushes and I'm watching them live their life. And I notice how they make their tea. They get their cup, they put a tea bag in, they put hot water in, then they put a little bit of milk. Then I go back home to Nigeria and I tell everyone, hey, this is British philosophy. They put the tea first, then they put the water, then they put the milk. And I talk to a British family as to why they did this, and they told me that this is the best way to make tea. They told me that this is the recipe that their forefathers passed down to them. This is philosophy in England. Now, on its face, this is ridiculous. Because, fun fact, there are a lot of conversations out there about what it takes to make the perfect cup of tea. I think, if I remember correctly, the BBC did a whole documentary on this back in the day. And so people have different opinions as to how to make the perfect British cup of tea. But this cultural practice, these cultural motifs are not philosophy. Now, you might say, and rightfully so, that this analogy is broken because you can't compare making a cup of tea with believing how long it would take for your ancestor to go into the ancestral plane. In the ancestor case, this is fairly metaphysical. The tea case is not so much. And this is a good point because you can say that for a lot of the things that the ethnophilosophers were talking about, they were dealing with philosophical issues. A lot of these cultural practices involve statements about morality, statements about metaphysics, statements about philosophy of mind and philosophy of language. And so although they are dealing with philosophical themes, the idea is that they are still not philosophy. Because philosophy for somebody like Wiredu or somebody like Hountondji is about a little bit more than your subject matter, a little bit more than the questions you ask. It's about what you do to try to make sense of those questions. What is your method? Alright, so with all this said, let us take Hountondji and Wiredu at their word here. If this is what philosophy is, if it requires this scientific method, then was there philosophy in traditional societies in Africa? Now, the complicated answer is that we'd have to take things on a case-by-case basis. But the slightly simpler and more tragic answer that Hountondji spends a bit of time touching on is that we'd have to conclude that no, by and large, there was no philosophy in a lot of these communities. And to reiterate what I said earlier, this is not a statement on the ability of Africans to comprehend philosophy. The idea here is that philosophy, like science, is a very contingent thing. It does not arise everywhere. The desire to do modern science based on the modern scientific method does not arise everywhere. Now you might say that that might be true, that's all well and good, but who cares? Why can't we just say that African philosophy is radically different from quote-unquote Western philosophy? So Western philosophy is based on science, it's based on all of these methods, it's based on all of these hypotheses, it's based on logic and reasoning and all of that jazz, but African philosophy is based on myths and proverbs and folklore. Why can't we just say that? What are Wiredu and Hountondji trying to do here? Are they trying to claim that in order for something to be philosophy, it has to be done in the way that Europeans have been doing philosophy? Because if that is the case, would that not imply that a lot of indigenous philosophies do not actually count as philosophies? They are simply cultural practices. Wouldn't that dismiss indigenous ways of knowing as legitimate ways of knowing? What are Wiredu and Hountondji trying to do here? Now, on some level, this is the point. And Wiredu and Hountondji would probably problematize the premise of this line of questioning, because there is a premise here that suggests that logic and reasoning are the products of Europeans, and so asking African philosophy to be based on logic and reasoning is playing the game of Europeans. But Wiredu and Hountondji would want to problematize that quite a bit. Logic, rationality, reason, these are not the creations of Europe. Wiredu and Hountondji are typically referred to as universalists in African philosophy. They believe that philosophy is a universal practice. It's not particular. So we cannot say that there is an African philosophy that is radically different from what happens in Europe. For people like Hountondji and Wiredu, philosophy is philosophy. It has to be the same in order to be philosophy. And philosophy is a universal practice because human beings are universal. All human beings have access to the universal. So the ability to use logic and reasoning and make use of the scientific method, these are not unique to Europeans in any way. Because Africans, being human beings, have the ability to engage with the scientific method, the idea is that to have true philosophy, to have true robust science, this is how we must do it. We have to use these methods. And these methods are universal. Now, you might hear all this and still be unconvinced. You might still be saying, why should we care about universality? Why should we care about logic and reasoning? Why does it seem like they are trying to make African philosophy seem like European philosophy? And to restate what I just said a few moments ago, I really do think Wiredu and Hountondji would problematize this premise. The use of logic and rationality, these are not unique to Europe in any way, shape, or form. Now, Wiredu has a very interesting essay called How Not to Compare African Thought with Western Thought. And in that, Wiredu reminds us that philosophy and science, these truly are contingent things. They do not arise everywhere, and they are not natural to any particular people group. Wiredu wants to remind us that not very long ago, in many places in Europe, the belief in witches was very deeply held by many people. And so Wiredu wants us to problematize the role of identity here, because it's easy for us to hold on to ethnophilosophy, to hold on to these cultures, and to hold on to them as things that are natural to us as Africans. So I could say that I am Nigerian, it is in my blood, it's in my DNA to believe in God, to believe in witches, to believe in the supernatural. Therefore, Nigerian philosophy must involve the supernatural. It cannot play the game of logic and reason, it must be based on a belief in the supernatural. And Wiredu wants to remind us that this belief in the supernatural that I could hold on to as part of my Nigerian identity is not unique to Nigeria, is not unique to Africa. There are many, many stories of witches and wizards and warlocks and dragons and trolls and gremlins all over Europe. Wiredu believes that this is all important to the story of modernity. Different people groups, different countries are on different stages on this road to modernity. And the stage of deeply believing in the supernatural is one pinpoint on that road to becoming modern. And it was not that long ago that Europe did not have what we now call modern science, and they existed in a way that was very heavily reliant on supernatural themes. A good example of this, of course, is alchemy, which is a precursor to chemistry. Alchemy is many things, but modern science, it is not. Now, you might say that there should be a place for alchemy in the world. You might say that it's a bad thing that we abandoned alchemy when we embraced modern science, and that is a claim that you can make, and we can keep alchemy around if you'd like. But the fact is that when it comes to doing modern science, we must understand that alchemy is not modern science. We must understand that when it comes to curing diseases, when it comes to building skyscrapers, when it comes to improving the material conditions of those involved, modern science has done an infinitely better job than alchemy could ever dream of doing. And so for Wiredu, if we want to compare African philosophy with European philosophy, the wrong way to do that would be to say, let me look at this belief among the Yoruba and compare it with Hegel. This is strange. We are comparing two things that don't really exist in the same world. For Wiredu, if we want to make this comparison, what we should do is we can compare something that exists in Yoruba metaphysics to something that existed in some part of Europe in their folklore. We have to compare folklore to folklore. Now again, some might take issue with this approach, but Wiredu's argument here I think is worth engaging with. Now at this point you might ask the question, well, what if we don't care about modernity? You might still say, as a Nigerian, it is in my blood to believe in God, to believe in the supernatural. I don't care about all this modern stuff. I don't care about all this rationality stuff. I want to exist in my own as a Nigerian, and Nigerian philosophy must reflect this. And in response to that, I would ask a simple question. Does Lagos need a subway? Now, I'm aware that Lagos is currently building something like a subway to help out with the transportation problems in the city, which is wonderful. So this is a rhetorical question. Lagos is the most populous city in Africa, and like any large metropolitan city, having a great subway helps. Being able to go from one part of the city to another in 30 minutes very regularly and for very cheap is a wonderful thing for any large city to have. So let's just take that as a given. Lagos does need a subway. It would be a good thing if Lagos had a subway. Now, our actual question here would be, if Lagos does need a subway, how shall we build it? Here's one option, using ethnophilosophy. One of the other foundational texts in the history of African philosophy is the book African Religions and Philosophies by John Mbiti. In that book, Mbiti talks about the concept of African time, a very popular concept in these circles. This is a chapter of the book that I think Wiredu himself referred to as the most philosophically interesting part of the book. This is Mbiti's idea in a nutshell. Mbiti suggests that time is of little academic concern to traditional Africans. In Mbiti's view, time is not something that controls traditional Africans. There's a contrast here between quote-unquote African time and quote-unquote Western time. African time is more fluid. African time is less rigid. African time is more vibey. The idea is that in African time, exact times do not exist. They do not matter. Things only matter when people are there to experience them. So if I say we should meet at 11 a.m., the idea here is that in the West, people are so bound by that 11 a.m. They become slaves to time. But with African time, 11 a.m. is more vibey. Maybe I show up at 11:30, maybe I show up at 12. It's irrelevant. I show up whenever I show up, and whatever we are going to do, we do when we all show up. So the idea is that African time is more chill. In a nutshell, that is the idea. Now, a couple of years ago, I made a video on African time on TikTok, and it did quite well, but I got a lot of reactions that I did not quite anticipate. I got a lot of people from across Africa's diaspora reaching out and saying how they felt vindicated by this conversation, because they always felt as though time was too rigid. They always felt as though quote-unquote Western time was always problematic. They always felt as though they naturally had a desire to approach time in a way that is more fluid. The idea is that in our nature as Africans, we reject this quote-unquote rigid concept of Western time. We seek out African time. We seek out a more fluid version of time. This is just who we are as Africans. Now our question becomes, if we want to build a subway in Lagos, how should we do it? With quote-unquote African time or with quote-unquote Western time? So let's say the subway is meant to leave at 11 a.m., but it doesn't actually leave at 11 a.m. It leaves whenever the driver wants. It leaves whenever all the passengers show up. And why do we do that? We can say, well, that's because we want to decolonize time. We want to embrace our Africanness. We want to reject the imperialism of the West. And so we create trains that leave whenever the driver feels like it, whenever everybody is on board. Because we do not want to be slaves to time like people in the quote-unquote West are. That is one option. Another option is that we do what every other major subway around the world does, and we have trains leave at a specific time so you can plan your journey around the departures of the train. Now, in a very reasonable sense, which one of those two options would most people probably prefer? I would say, I think the subway would be a better asset to the citizens of Lagos if it left at regular intervals, if it was reliable, if when it says it leaves at 11 a.m., it actually leaves at 11 a.m. so people could plan accordingly. Now you might ask yourself, but isn't this the same type of imperialism that Hountondji and Wiredu might be suggesting? Why should we conform to the concepts of quote-unquote Western time? Why should we not embrace our Africanness? And the response to that is similar to the response I gave earlier. A, this is not an African phenomenon, and B, this concept of time is not unique to the West. One of the most misleading things about African time, in my view, is that it takes this belief that is very common across rural communities around the world, and it makes it into a metaphysical, ontological African reality, where it is not. At this point, it would be a good time to point out that there is a similar phenomenon known as Korean time. You can find it in different places. And the idea is that back in the day, before there was massive industrialization around Korea, most people who lived rural lives practiced time that was essentially identical to what people call African time. This is not an African phenomenon. This is just a very understandable way of living if you live in a rural community. If you live in small communities, if you live in villages, you will naturally not have a very rigid concept of time. This is not ontological to my African identity. This is a product of living in a rural community. Now, Wiredu stresses the importance of reflecting on our cultures and deciding what things we want to keep and what things we want to throw away. This is part of what it means to think philosophically about cultural practices. And so the question is, we can ask ourselves as Nigerians, if we want to industrialize, if we want to build a subway in Lagos, does it make sense to hold on to this concept of time? And in many ways, it does not. And if we choose to abandon this concept of time and embrace something else, this is not a type of Western imperialism. This is a choice that we can make on what kind of society we want to be. And legitimately, if all of the wonderful philosophers watching this, who are from Nigeria or are from somewhere in Africa, can make a case for building a subway using African time, I'm willing to hear it. That could be a discussion that we have. But as it so happens, as someone who's a big fan of the tube in London and of the subway in New York, I really do think it just makes sense for the trains to leave on time. That was a slight tangent, but it was relevant, I hope. So for Hountondji, for Wiredu, philosophy is a universal practice, and Africans are more than welcome to engage in the beauty of philosophy because of our right as human beings to engage in a universal human practice. And an important part of philosophy is the conversation, is conversing with other thinkers who are dealing with similar issues that are philosophical. But as Hountondji says, we cannot fall into the trap of believing that our philosophies only exist in the past. African philosophy is something that we have the opportunity to create right now. Some other day, perhaps we will spend more time with Hountondji's arguments, more time with Wiredu's arguments, because there are many, many things that I could not quite touch on, and many important things that I had to brush over. But for now, this is a way to approach the question, what is African philosophy?